My fiancée spiked my drink at our engagement party. I lost 8 months and my surgical career. She has no idea I remember everything. The first thing I noticed when consciousness returned was the texture of institutional sheets against my skin, that particular blend of overwashed cotton and chemical detergent that exists only in hospitals and psychiatric facilities. My mouth tasted like rust and sedatives, my tongue thick and uncooperative when I tried to form words. The neurologist standing beside my bed had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, but her voice carried the careful neutrality of someone delivering news that would shatter whatever remained of my life. Dr. Ethan Rivera, I'm Dr. Patel. You've been with us at Meadowbrook Psychiatric Hospital for 8 months. Do you know why you're here? I tried to shake my head, but the movement made the room tilt sickeningly. My memories existed in fragments, sharp-edged pieces that didn't fit together properly, creating a picture I couldn't fully see but knew was wrong somehow. Dr. Patel explained patiently that I'd experienced a severe psychotic break at my engagement party to Dr. Olivia Cross, attacking 3 attendees before collapsing into catatonia that had lasted for months. She used terms like drug-induced psychosis and treatment-resistant symptoms and guarded prognosis, each phrase landing like a physical blow. I'd been a cardiothoracic surgery resident at Boston Memorial, she continued, one of the most promising in my class, until the incident had ended my career permanently. The Massachusetts Medical Board had revoked my license during my hospitalization after reviewing evidence of my violent behavior and the toxicology reports showing multiple controlled substances in my system at levels suggesting recreational use or suicide attempt. My hands lay motionless on the white sheets, the hands that had performed their first solo valve replacement 3 weeks before the engagement party, now legally prohibited from ever touching a patient again. Olivia visited that afternoon, and watching her walk through the door of my hospital room felt like observing someone I'd known in another life. She looked polished and professional in navy scrubs, with her hospital ID clipped to her pocket, her dark hair pulled back in the same neat bun she'd always worn in the operating room. Her face arranged itself into an expression of relief and concern that would have seemed genuine if I hadn't noticed the brief calculation in her eyes before the mask settled into place. Ethan, thank God you're awake. I've been so worried. She took my hand and I felt her fingers against mine, warm and steady, the hands of a surgeon who'd continued working while I'd been trapped in pharmaceutical fog. She talked about how frightening the engagement party had been, how I'd suddenly become violent and incoherent, how she'd called 911 while trying to protect the other guests from my attacks. The story she told didn't match the fragments in my head, but the fragments were so broken and incomplete that I couldn't articulate why her version felt wrong. I remembered champagne, the golden bubbles catching light from the restaurant's chandeliers. I remembered Olivia handing me a fresh glass after I'd finished my first, her smile bright and affectionate as she toasted our future together. I remembered the taste changing subtly, something bitter underneath the expensive sweetness, and thinking maybe they'd switched bottles. Then the memories shattered into disconnected images that Dr. Patel said were typical of drug-induced psychosis, faces distorting into something monstrous, the certainty that everyone at the party was trying to kill me, the need to fight, to escape, to make it stop. Nothing after that until waking in this bed 8 months later with my career and my life destroyed. Olivia explained that she'd stood by me throughout the hospitalization despite advice from colleagues to distance herself professionally. She'd visited twice weekly, sat with me during my catatonic periods, advocated for my treatment with the psychiatric team. Her voice carried the weight of sacrifice and devotion, painting herself as the loyal fiancée who'd refused to abandon her partner during his mental health crisis. She mentioned almost casually that the fellowship position we'd both been competing for had been awarded to her 3 months ago, that she'd been reluctant to accept it given the circumstances, but our program director had insisted someone needed to fill the role. The fellowship was a 2-year position in advanced cardiac surgery techniques at Mass General, the most prestigious training opportunity in the Northeast, guaranteed to launch whoever completed it into the top tier of cardiac surgery. I'd wanted it desperately. We both had. Now it was hers alone, and I was a former surgeon with a revoked license and a psychiatric hospitalization that would follow me forever. She stayed for 90 minutes, talking about her new responsibilities and asking gentle questions about my recovery that I couldn't answer coherently. My thoughts moved like molasses, each sentence requiring enormous effort to construct, my responses delayed by seconds that stretched awkwardly. Olivia's expression stayed sympathetic, but I caught micro-expressions flickering beneath the surface. Impatience, or maybe satisfaction, gone too quickly to identify with certainty. She promised to visit again soon and kissed my forehead before leaving, the gesture tender and performative in equal measure. After she left, I lay staring at the acoustic ceiling tiles and tried to force my damaged mind to remember what had actually happened at the engagement party. The effort produced only more fragments, images that might have been memories or might have been hallucinations, impossible to distinguish with certainty. But underneath the pharmaceutical confusion was a growing conviction that something about Olivia's story was fundamentally wrong. The psychiatric team kept me another 6 weeks for stabilization and cognitive assessment. Dr. Patel explained that the drugs in my system at the engagement party had been a combination of benzodiazepines, dissociatives, and hallucinogens at dangerous concentrations, the kind of mixture that suggested either a suicide attempt or extremely reckless recreational use. I'd insisted from my first coherent moments that I'd never taken drugs recreationally, that someone must have spiked my drink, but the explanation was dismissed as typical denial from patients who'd experienced drug-induced psychosis. The toxicology couldn't determine whether the drugs had been ingested voluntarily or administered without consent, only that they'd been present at levels that would cause severe psychological disturbance. Combined with my violent behavior and the lack of any evidence supporting my drugging claim, the medical and legal consensus was that I'd suffered a mental health crisis, possibly triggered by performance pressure and the stress of upcoming marriage. My parents visited weekly, their faces etched with confusion and grief over what had happened to their son who'd been accepted to MIT at 16 and completed medical school at 24. They'd aged visibly during my hospitalization, my mother's hair now streaked with gray she'd been dyeing before, my father moving with the careful slowness of someone who'd experienced a health scare. They asked careful questions about my mental state and whether I remembered why I'd taken the drugs, their voices carrying the particular pain of parents trying to understand how they'd missed signs of their child's psychological deterioration. I told them repeatedly that I hadn't taken anything voluntarily, that someone had drugged me, but I watched their expressions shift to the worried patience of people humoring a mentally ill relative. The evidence said I'd voluntarily consumed drugs that destroyed my mind and my career, and no amount of my insistence could override toxicology reports and witness statements. Discharge came with restrictions and requirements that formalized my new reality. I couldn't practice medicine, couldn't prescribe medications, needed regular psychiatric follow-up, and had to disclose my hospitalization on any future employment applications. Dr. Patel prescribed maintenance medications for what she called my underlying psychiatric condition, antipsychotics, and mood stabilizers that I'd need to take indefinitely to prevent future episodes. The medications made my thinking even slower, wrapping my cognition in layers of pharmaceutical cotton that muffled emotional responses and cognitive sharpness equally. I moved into my parents' house because I couldn't afford my apartment anymore without my residency stipend, sleeping in my childhood bedroom surrounded by high school debate trophies and college textbooks that belonged to someone who no longer existed. The person I'd been had died at that engagement party. This medicated shadow was all that remained. Olivia maintained contact during the first month after my discharge, calling weekly to check on my recovery and stopping by my parents' house twice for brief visits. She talked about her fellowship work, describing complex surgical procedures with the detailed enthusiasm I remembered from when we'd been equals discussing cases. Her career was accelerating exactly as we'd both planned ours would, except now she traveled that path alone while I collected disability payments and attended outpatient therapy groups. She mentioned during her second visit that she'd started seeing someone casually, a vascular surgery attending named Dr. Marcus Ashford, who worked at the same hospital. She framed it apologetically, saying she'd tried to wait but couldn't put her life on hold indefinitely, that she hoped I understood. I told her I understood because what else could I say, knowing that any emotional reaction would be interpreted as psychiatric instability, requiring increased medication. The fragments of memory from the engagement party haunted me despite the antipsychotics meant to suppress intrusive thoughts. I'd wake at 3 a.m. with images flashing behind my eyes, Olivia's face in the moment she'd handed me the second champagne glass, something in her expression that my drugged mind had initially missed, but my subconscious had recorded. The memory was too incomplete to trust, too tangled with drug-induced hallucinations to present as evidence, but it lodged in my consciousness like a splinter I couldn't extract. I started writing down every fragment I could recall, filling a notebook with disconnected observations that might have been memories or might have been confabulation, my handwriting shaky from the medication tremors. The psychiatrist I saw weekly for follow-up interpreted my obsession with the engagement party as fixation on trauma and gently suggested that accepting what had happened would be healthier than searching for alternative explanations that didn't exist. 3 months after discharge, I stopped taking the antipsychotics. The decision was dangerous and potentially stupid, but the medications had reduced me to a functioning shell, and I needed to think clearly, even if that clarity came with risks. I tapered carefully, reducing doses incrementally to avoid withdrawal, telling no one because admitting medication non-compliance would trigger forced hospitalization. Within 2 weeks, my mind started emerging from the pharmaceutical fog, thoughts becoming sharper and faster, emotions returning with intensity that was painful, but felt more real than the muffled numbness. The memory fragments became clearer without the medication suppressing them, and I started seeing patterns I'd missed while cognitively impaired. The way Olivia had positioned herself near the champagne table during the party, the timing of her bathroom break right before she'd handed me the second glass, the strange taste I'd noticed and dismissed, details that might mean nothing or might mean everything. I called my former MIT roommate, a guy named Julian Park, who now worked as a data security consultant in San Francisco. We'd stayed close after college, and he'd visited twice during my hospitalization, one of the few people who'd treated me like I was still myself rather than a psychiatric patient to be managed. I explained that I needed help accessing security footage from the restaurant where the engagement party had been held, that I suspected someone had drugged me deliberately but had no proof. Julian was quiet for a long moment before asking if I was supposed to be investigating this or if my doctors knew what I was doing. I admitted I'd stopped taking my medications and was pursuing this against medical advice. He said he'd help anyway because he'd known me for a decade and couldn't reconcile the person I'd been with someone who'd voluntarily take drugs that destroyed his career. He asked for the restaurant name and date, said he'd see what he could find. Julian called back 3 days later with news that the restaurant's security system had been upgraded 8 months ago and the old footage had been erased during the transition. The company that installed the new system might have backup archives, but accessing them would require either a warrant or permission from the restaurant, neither of which I could obtain without evidence justifying the request. The dead end felt crushing until Julian mentioned that several guests had posted photos and videos from the engagement party on social media, and while most had been taken down out of respect after my hospitalization, some might still exist in cached versions or on people's devices. He suggested I contact guests directly and ask if anyone had footage from the party, particularly video taken near the champagne table. The approach felt invasive and pathetic, but I had no alternatives, so I started compiling a list of everyone who'd attended and systematically reaching out. Most people responded with some version of sympathetic discomfort, offering support for my recovery while declining to discuss the engagement party. A few sent photos they'd taken showing me looking normal and happy in the early evening, before whatever happened had happened. My college friend Amanda Liu sent a video she'd filmed on her phone while dancing, the background showing various guests mingling, including a few seconds of Olivia near the bar area. The footage was brief and poorly framed, but I watched it 30 times in a row, studying every pixel of Olivia's movements. She appeared to be talking to someone off camera while standing near the champagne bottles, her body angled to block the view of what her hands were doing. The video quality was too poor to show details, and the timestamp indicated it was taken 40 minutes before my psychotic break, but it placed her near the alcohol during the relevant time frame. Dr. Neil Roth, an emergency medicine attending who'd been at the party, sent an email that changed everything. He'd been one of the people I'd allegedly attacked during my psychotic episode, and his message opened with careful language about understanding that I'd been mentally ill and not responsible for my actions. But he included information that made my hands shake while reading. He'd been working in the ER the night they'd brought me in and had personally overseen my initial treatment. The toxicology panel had shown unusually high concentrations of midazolam and ketamine, drugs that were both controlled substances typically used in hospital settings, combined with what appeared to be LSD or a similar hallucinogen. The combination wasn't typical of recreational drug use because the specific medications weren't commonly available outside medical facilities. He'd found it strange at the time, but the working assumption had been that I'd somehow obtained hospital drugs for recreational purposes, perhaps through my access as a surgical resident. Dr. Roth's email continued with a detail that he'd mentioned to investigators, but which hadn't been included in official reports because it seemed irrelevant. Several other people at the engagement party had complained of feeling unusually tired or dizzy during the evening, symptoms consistent with low-dose benzodiazepine exposure. No one else had experienced psychotic symptoms or been hospitalized, but the pattern suggested that multiple drinks might have been contaminated with sedatives, possibly including mine, at much higher concentration. The police had investigated briefly, but found no evidence of systematic drugging and concluded that people had simply been drinking too much at an open bar event. Dr. Roth said he'd always wondered about the coincidence, but had no proof of anything sinister. His email ended with an offer to discuss further if I wanted, and his personal cell phone number. I called him immediately. Dr. Roth agreed to meet at a coffee shop in Cambridge, far enough from Boston Memorial that we wouldn't encounter colleagues. He looked uncomfortable when I arrived, the expression of someone who'd been debating whether helping me was appropriate or just enabling potential delusions. I showed him the notebook where I'd documented every memory fragment and the timeline I'd constructed of the engagement party. He listened carefully while I explained my theory that Olivia had deliberately drugged me to trigger a psychotic episode that would eliminate me as competition for the fellowship. The theory sounded insane spoken aloud, the paranoid accusation of someone with documented psychiatric issues against his successful fiancée who'd stood by him. But Dr. Roth didn't dismiss it immediately. Instead, he asked questions about Olivia's access to controlled substances and whether I knew of any motive beyond professional competition. I explained that Olivia and I had been the top 2 candidates for the fellowship, that our relationship had become strained in the months before the engagement party as the selection date approached. We'd started as colleagues who respected each other's skills, had dated for 18 months before I'd proposed, but underneath the romantic relationship was constant competitive tension. Every case we scrubbed in on became an unspoken contest about who performed better. Every presentation to attendings felt like a competition for approval. The engagement had been partly genuine affection and partly a way to neutralize the rivalry by becoming a team instead of opponents. But the fellowship selection process had reignited the competition, because only one person could receive the position, and whoever didn't get it would be left behind professionally. I'd known my surgical skills were slightly better than Olivia's, based on objective assessments and case outcomes. She'd known it too. The fellowship should have been mine. Dr. Roth asked if I had any evidence beyond suspicion and fragmented memories. I showed him the video Amanda had sent with Olivia near the champagne table, admitted it proved nothing definitive, but established opportunity. He studied the footage and then asked a question that changed the direction of everything. Had anyone checked Olivia's controlled substance access records during the time period before the engagement party? Hospital pharmacies tracked every medication dispensed and every provider who accessed controlled substances, creating detailed logs that could show if someone had been taking drugs without proper documentation. If Olivia had stolen the medications used to drug me, there might be records of missing inventory or unusual access patterns during the relevant time frame. The records would require a warrant to access officially, but Dr. Roth said he knew someone in hospital administration who might be willing to review the data informally if approached carefully. The contact was a woman named Grace Wu, who worked in hospital compliance and risk management. Dr. Roth explained my situation carefully, framing it as a request from someone trying to understand what had happened during a psychiatric crisis, rather than a formal investigation. Grace was skeptical initially, pointing out that accessing personnel records without cause violated multiple policies and could cost her job. But Dr. Roth emphasized the unusual toxicology findings and the pattern of other guests feeling ill, suggesting there might be a patient safety issue if someone had been stealing controlled substances. Grace agreed finally to review Olivia's access logs off the record, warning that if she found anything concerning, she'd have to report it through official channels regardless of personal consequences. She said she'd need a few days to pull the records discreetly and would contact Dr. Roth with results. Grace called 5 days later and asked to meet in person. We gathered in Dr. Roth's apartment in Brookline, the three of us sitting around his kitchen table while Grace pulled up files on her laptop. Her expression was troubled in a way that made my pulse accelerate before she'd said anything. The records showed that Olivia had accessed the controlled substance dispensary 11 times in the 2 weeks before the engagement party, significantly more than her usual pattern. Most instances were during evening shifts when fewer people were around to observe. She'd signed out medications for specific patients, but Grace had cross-referenced the patient charts and found that several of the alleged recipients hadn't been prescribed those drugs. The discrepancies suggested Olivia had been falsifying documentation to steal midazolam and ketamine, the same drugs that had shown up in my toxicology at dangerous concentrations. Grace explained that she'd also found something else disturbing. Olivia had filed a controlled substance loss report 3 days before the engagement party, claiming that a vial of midazolam had fallen from her pocket and shattered in a stairwell, requiring disposal. The report had been accepted without investigation, because medication losses happened occasionally, and Olivia's record had been clean prior to that incident. But the timing was suspicious, and the quantity of the lost medication roughly matched what would have been needed to create the concentration found in my system. Grace had compiled everything into a document that she handed to Dr. Roth on a flash drive, her hands shaking slightly. This is enough to trigger a formal investigation by the hospital and probably law enforcement. I'm required to report it to my supervisor, which means it becomes official tomorrow morning. I wanted you to see it first, because this is your life, and you deserve to know the truth before everything explodes. I sat staring at the laptop screen showing Olivia's controlled substance access logs, the proof I'd been searching for that someone had deliberately destroyed my career and my mind. The evidence wasn't perfect or conclusive enough to guarantee criminal charges, but it was substantial enough to raise serious questions about what had happened at the engagement party. Dr. Roth asked what I wanted to do with the information. I could let Grace report it through official channels and let the investigation proceed, which would be slow and bureaucratic, and might never result in charges if Olivia had covered her tracks carefully. Or I could confront Olivia directly with what I'd found and try to get a confession before she knew about the investigation. The second option was risky because it would alert her to destroy any remaining evidence, but it also offered the possibility of catching her off guard before she'd prepared defensive strategies. I chose confrontation because I needed to see her face when presented with evidence of what she'd done. I called Olivia and asked if we could meet to discuss something important about my recovery. She agreed immediately with concern in her voice that sounded genuine, suggesting dinner at a quiet restaurant in the South End. I countered by proposing we meet at the apartment she'd rented in Cambridge, claiming I didn't want to risk a public breakdown if the conversation became emotional. She hesitated briefly before agreeing, giving me the address and suggesting Thursday evening. The 3-day wait felt interminable, but gave me time to prepare exactly what I'd say and how I'd approach getting her to admit the truth. Julian helped me purchase a small recording device that looked like a pen, legal to use in Massachusetts with single-party consent. I'd record everything, and if Olivia confessed, I'd have evidence that could support criminal charges. Thursday evening, I stood outside Olivia's apartment building in Cambridge, a renovated brownstone that looked expensive and successful, exactly the kind of place a promising fellowship recipient would rent. My hands were shaking despite the anti-anxiety medication I'd taken, Not from the medications, but from what I was about to attempt. I pressed the buzzer, and Olivia's voice came through the intercom, welcoming me up to the third floor. She opened the door wearing casual clothes, jeans, and a sweater that made her look younger and less threatening than her surgical scrubs did. Her apartment was tastefully decorated with modern furniture and medical textbooks, the home of someone building a successful career. She offered wine, and I declined, saying I couldn't drink with my medications. She poured herself a glass, and we sat in her living room with uncomfortable distance between us on the couch. I started carefully, explaining that I'd been working with a therapist on recovering memories from the engagement party and had remembered some details that troubled me. Olivia's expression stayed sympathetic and attentive, encouraging me to continue. I described the memory of her handing me the champagne with something off about the taste, admitted I knew it sounded paranoid but couldn't shake the feeling that something had been added to my drink. I watched her face carefully while speaking and saw a micro-expression flash across her features, something between alarm and calculation, gone almost instantly. She responded with exactly the right level of concern, saying that trauma sometimes created false memories, and I shouldn't trust everything my mind produced, given the psychotic episode I'd experienced. She suggested I discuss these thoughts with my psychiatrist before fixating on them. I pushed further, explaining that I'd obtained my toxicology report and noticed the specific drugs in my system weren't typical of recreational use. The combination of midazolam and ketamine with hallucinogens suggested someone with medical knowledge had created a mixture designed to cause psychosis rather than euphoria. Olivia's body language shifted subtly, her posture becoming more defensive even as her expression stayed concerned. She pointed out that I'd had access to the same medications as a surgical resident and might have taken them during a mental health crisis I wasn't remembering clearly. The suggestion that I'd drugged myself was delivered gently but firmly, redirecting suspicion back toward my psychiatric problems. I felt anger building beneath the surface, but kept my voice calm and asked directly whether she'd ever accessed controlled substances without proper documentation. The question landed like a physical blow. Olivia went very still, her wine glass frozen halfway to her mouth, and I watched her process the implications of what I'd just asked. She recovered quickly, too quickly, her response prepared, as if she'd been expecting this conversation eventually. She said she didn't appreciate being accused of drugging me when she'd stood by me throughout my hospitalization while everyone else had written me off. She listed everything she'd sacrificed to support me. The emotional toll of watching my mental health deteriorate, the professional awkwardness of being engaged to someone who'd had a psychotic breakdown. The counterattack was designed to make me feel guilty for questioning her loyalty, but underneath the offended tone, I heard something else. Fear. She knew something was coming and was preparing defenses. I pulled out my phone and showed her the video Amanda had sent, the brief footage of Olivia near the champagne table at the engagement party. I explained that I'd been gathering evidence systematically, talking to guests, and reviewing everyone's movements during the relevant time frame. The video wasn't proof, but it established that she'd had opportunity to spike my drink. Olivia studied the footage and then laughed, the sound brittle and forced. She said showing her standing near a bar at her own engagement party proved nothing, except that she'd been getting drinks like everyone else. But her hands were trembling slightly, and she set down her wine glass as if afraid she might drop it. I mentioned that multiple other guests had felt ill during the party, suggesting widespread drugging, and that the police had simply failed to investigate thoroughly. Olivia's face went pale beneath her makeup. I made my final move, explaining that hospital compliance had reviewed controlled substance access records and found irregularities in her usage patterns during the weeks before the engagement party. I didn't mention Grace specifically or indicate that an official investigation was imminent, letting Olivia believe I'd somehow obtained the information independently. Her reaction was immediate and devastating, confirmation written across her features before she could control her expression. She knew exactly what records I was referring to and knew what they showed. She tried to recover, claiming any discrepancies were clerical errors or legitimate patient care she could document, but her voice lacked conviction. She asked how I'd accessed confidential personnel records, shifting to offense by questioning my methods. I ignored the question and asked again directly whether she'd stolen controlled substances to drug me at the engagement party. The silence stretched for 30 seconds that felt eternal. Olivia stared at me with an expression cycling through calculation, defiance, and something that might have been regret. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet and almost sad. "You were going to get the fellowship. Everyone knew it. Your surgical precision was better than mine. Your case outcomes were better. The attendings preferred you. I'd worked just as hard, sacrificed just as much. But I was always going to be second place behind Dr. Ethan Rivera, the genius who got into MIT at 16. The bitterness in her tone was corrosive, years of resentment distilled into a few sentences. She explained that she'd initially only planned to make me sick enough to miss the final fellowship presentations, thinking moderate sedation would cause flu-like symptoms that would keep me home for a crucial day. But she'd miscalculated the dosage, or I'd drunk more than expected, and the combination had triggered a psychotic break instead of just sedation. She claimed she'd panicked when I'd started acting violent and incoherent, that calling 911 and playing the concerned fiancée had been genuine fear for my safety, combined with self-preservation. She'd spent the 8 months of my hospitalization terrified that I'd wake up with clear memories and destroy her career with accusations. When I'd emerged confused and cognitively impaired, she'd realized the drugs had caused permanent damage that made me no longer credible. She'd maintained the supportive fiancé act partly from guilt and partly to ensure I stayed convinced my breakdown had been mental illness rather than drugging. The confession spilled out like she'd been carrying the weight alone for too long and finally needed to share the burden with someone. She looked at me with something resembling pleading in her eyes, asking if I understood that she'd never intended to permanently harm me, that the outcome had been an accident rather than deliberate cruelty. I asked if the recording device in my pocket had captured everything clearly, speaking loudly enough to ensure the microphone picked up my words. Olivia's face transformed from vulnerable to furious in an instant, realizing she'd been manipulated into confessing. She lunged toward me, trying to grab my jacket where the pen was clipped, and I blocked her reflexively, old surgical resident instincts making me faster despite months of medications. She screamed that the recording was illegal and inadmissible, that I'd tricked her and any lawyer would get it thrown out. I corrected her calmly, explaining that Massachusetts was a one-party consent state, and I'd had every right to record our conversation without her knowledge. The recording might not be perfect legal evidence, but combined with the controlled substance access logs and the toxicology reports, it built a compelling case that would interest prosecutors and medical boards. Olivia started crying then, genuine tears rather than performative emotion, the breakdown of someone watching their carefully constructed life disintegrate. She begged me not to report her, claiming she'd lose everything, including her medical license and fellowship, and would probably face criminal charges. She offered to resign from the fellowship and recommend me as replacement, offered to publicly admit what she'd done and face professional consequences if I'd agree not to pursue criminal charges. The offers were desperate and meaningless, because she'd already destroyed my surgical career permanently, and no amount of professional redemption would restore the 8 months I'd lost or reverse the brain changes from the drugs she'd used. I told her that Grace Wu was reporting the controlled substance discrepancies tomorrow morning and that an official investigation was already beginning regardless of what I decided. Then I left her apartment while she was still crying and drove directly to the police station. Detective Sharon Ortiz took my statement and listened to the recording with an expression that shifted from skepticism to grim determination. She explained that drug-facilitated assault cases were difficult to prosecute because they relied heavily on victim credibility and often came down to he-said-she-said scenarios. But this case had unusual corroboration through the hospital records, the toxicology evidence, and the recorded confession. She'd need to consult with the district attorney about charges, but believed they'd pursue prosecution for assault with intent to cause bodily harm and possibly attempted murder depending on how they interpreted Olivia's intent. The medical board would conduct parallel investigation that would likely result in license suspension or revocation, regardless of criminal outcome. Detective Ortiz asked if I understood that going forward meant extensive legal proceedings and public exposure of everything that had happened, including my psychiatric hospitalization. I confirmed I understood and was prepared to pursue justice, regardless of personal cost. The hospital launched its investigation within days of Grace's report, and Olivia was suspended immediately pending review. The controlled substance discrepancies were serious enough to warrant criminal investigation, even without my accusations, and the pharmacy board got involved to assess whether there had been systematic theft. News of the investigation reached Boston Memorial's rumor network quickly, and suddenly everyone who'd treated me with sympathy for my mental breakdown was reassessing the narrative. Dr. Roth contacted several people from the engagement party and asked them to provide formal statements about feeling ill during the event, creating a pattern of drugging that supported my case. 3 guests came forward reporting symptoms consistent with benzodiazepine exposure, none serious enough to have sought treatment, but all concerning in retrospect. The accumulating evidence transformed the story from a sad case of mental illness to a deliberate assault by someone trusted with access to dangerous medications. The district attorney filed charges 6 weeks after my visit to Olivia's apartment. The formal charges were assault and battery with a dangerous weapon, the weapon being the controlled substances she'd used to drug me, along with larceny of drugs and professional misconduct. The attempted murder charge had been considered but rejected because proving Olivia intended to kill me, rather than just incapacitate me temporarily, was difficult given her recorded confession. The maximum sentence for the charges filed was 15 years in prison, plus permanent revocation of her medical license. Olivia hired a prominent criminal defense attorney, who immediately filed motions to suppress the recorded confession, arguing I'd obtained it through deception and emotional manipulation. The motion was denied because Massachusetts law clearly permitted single-party consent recording, and my methods, while ethically questionable, were legally sound. The preliminary hearing happened in November, 11 months after the engagement party that had destroyed my surgical career. I testified about the fragments I'd remembered and the investigation I'd conducted, presenting myself as someone who'd been cognitively impaired but had fought through the disability to find truth. Olivia's attorney tried to discredit me by emphasizing my psychiatric hospitalization and suggesting my memories were unreliable fabrications influenced by paranoid delusions. The strategy might have worked except for the controlled substance logs and the recording of Olivia's confession, evidence that corroborated my account independent of my credibility. The judge found probable cause to proceed to trial and set bail at $200,000, which Olivia's parents posted within hours. She was released with conditions including surrender of her medical license and prohibition from contacting me or any witnesses. The medical board moved faster than the criminal justice system. They held hearings in December, reviewing the evidence of controlled substance theft and the recorded confession where Olivia admitted to drugging me. The board's jurisdiction was narrower than criminal court, focused specifically on whether Olivia had violated professional standards and posed a danger to patients. The conclusion was unanimous and swift. Olivia's medical license was permanently revoked for gross professional misconduct and drug diversion. She'd never practice medicine again in any capacity, couldn't prescribe medications or work in clinical settings. The career she'd destroyed mine to advance had ended completely, all the years of training and sacrifice rendered worthless by her decision to spike my champagne with drugs stolen from patients. The board's written decision noted that physicians who weaponized their medical access betrayed fundamental trust and couldn't be allowed near patients regardless of other qualifications. The criminal trial began in February, 14 months after the engagement party. Jury selection took 3 days as Olivia's attorney eliminated anyone with medical background or personal experience with drugging. The final jury was 8 women and 4 men, mostly middle-aged, with expressions suggesting they understood the seriousness of what they were evaluating. The prosecution's opening statement was straightforward and damning. They presented the timeline of Olivia's controlled substance access, the toxicology showing those same drugs in my system, the video placing her near the champagne table, and the recorded confession tying everything together. The prosecutor, a woman named Lisa Thornton, emphasized that this wasn't a case of mental illness or recreational drug use gone wrong. It was deliberate assault by someone who'd used her medical training and access to eliminate professional competition by causing permanent brain damage to her fiancé. Olivia's defense strategy focused on minimizing intent and emphasizing accident. Her attorney, a man named Robert Finch, admitted that Olivia had made terrible choices by stealing medications and drugging me, but argued she'd only intended to make me moderately ill, not to cause permanent damage or life-threatening psychosis. He portrayed her as someone who'd made a desperate mistake under intense pressure rather than as a calculating would-be murderer. The defense presented character witnesses describing Olivia as a dedicated physician and caring person who'd made one catastrophic error in judgment. Finch argued that prison time would serve no rehabilitative purpose, since Olivia had already lost her medical career and would never have opportunity to harm anyone similarly again. The argument was designed to appeal to jurors' mercy and reduce charges to something less than assault with a dangerous weapon. I testified on the second day of trial, walking through my memories of the engagement party and the 8 months of hospitalization that followed. I described waking up with my career destroyed and being told I'd voluntarily taken drugs I'd never touched, the gaslighting of having everyone, including my doctors, assume I was lying or delusional about being drugged. I explained the cognitive impairment that had made investigating difficult, and the determination that had driven me to find evidence despite being medicated and dismissed. Under cross-examination, Finch tried to suggest that my investigation had been motivated by jealousy over Olivia's fellowship, rather than genuine search for truth. I pointed out that I'd lost my career and 8 months of my life. That jealousy seemed like an inadequate explanation for seeking evidence of what had actually happened. Several jurors nodded in apparent agreement. Dr. Roth testified about the unusual toxicology and the pattern of other guests feeling ill, establishing that multiple people had likely been drugged, even if I'd received the most concentrated dose. Grace Wu explained the controlled substance logs and the discrepancies that had triggered her investigation. The evidence was technical, but she presented it clearly, showing that Olivia had systematically stolen medications over a 2-week period leading up to the engagement party. The pharmacy director testified that the quantities stolen roughly matched what would have been needed to create the concentration found in my system, suggesting premeditation rather than impulsive action. Detective Ortiz testified about interviewing Olivia after I'd brought in the recording, noting that Olivia had initially denied everything before eventually admitting to theft and drugging under pressure of overwhelming evidence. The recording of Olivia's confession played for the jury on day 4 of trial, her voice filling the courtroom as she explained that she'd drugged me because I was going to get the fellowship she wanted. The emotional impact was devastating, even though jurors had already heard descriptions of what she'd said. Hearing Olivia's actual voice admitting she'd stolen drugs to spike my drink, hearing her claim she'd only meant to make me sick rather than cause permanent damage, made the premeditation undeniable. Several jurors looked physically uncomfortable during the playback. Finch objected multiple times, claiming various parts should be redacted but was overruled consistently. When the recording ended, the courtroom was silent except for someone in the gallery crying softly. Olivia testified in her own defense on day 5, probably against Finch's advice, but necessary, because she was her only character witness who could explain her mindset. She admitted to everything alleged, but framed it as a moment of desperate weakness, rather than calculated cruelty. She described the pressure of the fellowship competition and how living in my shadow had eroded her confidence over years. She claimed she'd been prescribed anti-anxiety medication and had been taking it at higher doses than prescribed, which had impaired her judgment when making the decision to drug me. The explanation felt like a manipulation of the same mental health sympathy I'd been denied during my hospitalization, using psychiatric medication as excuse for behavior she'd carefully planned over 2 weeks. Under cross-examination, Thornton systematically dismantled the impaired judgment defense by showing that Olivia had stolen medications incrementally, filed a false report to cover her tracks, and executed her plan at a crowded public event, all actions requiring clear thinking rather than impaired decision-making. Closing arguments happened on day 6. Thornton walked the jury through every piece of evidence methodically, building a narrative of premeditated assault by someone who'd weaponized her medical access to destroy competition. She emphasized that Olivia had stolen medications meant for patients, drugs that could have saved lives in emergencies, and had used them to cause a psychotic break that permanently damaged my brain and ended my surgical career. She asked the jury to hold Olivia accountable, not just for her intent, but for the actual consequences of her actions, the 8 months I'd lost, the career that would never be recovered, the ongoing cognitive challenges I'd face forever. Finch's closing argued that strict punishment wouldn't serve justice because Olivia had already lost her career and posed no ongoing threat. He asked jurors to consider that people could make terrible mistakes without being irredeemable monsters, that Olivia deserved mercy proportional to her intent rather than the unintended consequences. The jury deliberated for 9 hours across 2 days before returning a verdict. Guilty on all counts, including assault and battery with a dangerous weapon, larceny of controlled substances, and filing false reports. The verdict was read by the forewoman in a steady voice that made each guilty pronouncement feel final and irrevocable. Olivia's face was blank when the verdict was announced, like she'd already processed that this outcome was inevitable once all the evidence had been presented. Her parents sobbed in the gallery, but I felt only cold satisfaction, the knowledge that justice had come, even if it couldn't restore what I'd lost. Sentencing was scheduled for 6 weeks later to allow both sides to prepare impact statements and recommendations. The victim impact statement I prepared with Thornton's help detailed everything Olivia's assault had stolen, not just 8 months of unconsciousness, or my surgical career, or my medical license, but my identity as someone who'd spent 18 years training to become a cardiac surgeon. I described the cognitive challenges I still faced, the medications I needed to prevent seizures, the tremor in my hands that made fine motor tasks difficult. I explained that I'd need to find a completely different career path because I'd never work in medicine again, that all the years of education and training had been rendered worthless by someone who'd claimed to love me. I asked the judge to impose the maximum sentence allowable because Olivia had shown no genuine remorse beyond self-pity over her ruined career, and because other physicians needed to understand that weaponizing medical access carried severe consequences. Sentencing happened in April, 16 months after the engagement party. Judge Whitmore had presided over the trial with professional detachment, but his sentencing statement made clear what he thought of Olivia's conduct. He noted that she'd occupied a position of extreme trust and responsibility, that she'd been granted access to dangerous medications, specifically because she was supposed to protect patients, and that she'd betrayed that trust by stealing drugs to assault someone. He rejected the defense argument for lenient sentencing, stating that first-time offenders who commit calculated assaults using their professional access didn't deserve reduced sentences simply because they hadn't been caught before. He sentenced Olivia to 12 years in state prison with no possibility of parole before serving at least 8 years. She'd be 38 years old before having any chance at release, and she'd carry a felony conviction and revoked medical license for the rest of her life. Olivia was remanded to custody immediately, led out of the courtroom in handcuffs while her parents screamed that 12 years was excessive for someone who hadn't intended permanent harm. Judge Whitmore's response was measured but firm. Your daughter stole medications from patients and used them to cause a psychotic break that permanently damaged her fiancé's brain and ended his surgical career. 12 years is appropriate for the calculated nature of the offense and the devastating consequences she caused. The courtroom emptied slowly after the sentencing, people filing out with the subdued expressions of those who'd witnessed something simultaneously satisfying and tragic. I stayed sitting in the gallery after everyone left, alone in the empty courtroom, feeling the weight of justice delivered but unable to celebrate because it couldn't undo what had been done. 2 years after the engagement party, I started medical school again. Not as a returning surgical resident, but as someone starting completely over in a different specialty that didn't require the fine motor control cardiac surgery demanded. My hand tremor and cognitive challenges meant I'd never operate again, but I could still practice medicine in fields that relied more on diagnostic thinking than surgical precision. The medical board had restored my license after reviewing evidence that my drug-induced psychosis had been assault rather than voluntary use, acknowledging that I'd been the victim rather than someone with substance abuse problems. Starting over at 28 felt humiliating and surreal, but also gave me purpose beyond anger and loss. Olivia had taken the career I'd planned, but she hadn't destroyed my ability to eventually practice medicine in some form. The path would be longer and harder, but it existed, and every day I studied, every patient I eventually helped, would be proof that her assault had failed to destroy me completely, even if it had changed everything forever. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.